All right. Well, in 2019, Selma Middle School earned an F school letter grade. Students in every performance subgroup were not demonstrating growth. News media outlets wrote, quote, state education officials on November 7th, 2019 released a list of 69 schools that qualify for inclusion in the innovative school district based on their low state test scores. The lowest performing schools that remain on the list for 4 years in a row are slated to be taken over by the Innovative School District, which would hire a group to run their day to day operations. Selma Middle was on this very list of potential takeover by the State Department. There were 69 North Carolina schools on this list. Selma was number 10, and therefore the 10th lowest overall in academic performance in a state with close to 2,500 schools in 2019. At the district level, Selma Middle did not meet growth for 5 consecutive years, 2015 through 2019. Unfortunately, Selma was not alone. Selma was one of 14 schools in its district with a state designation of low performing. 2019 was a significant year for Selma Middle School. Principal Stephen Baker left his role as a district academic innovation officer and chose to lead Selma Middle at a most difficult juncture. The new chapter of this story only begins in 2019. Let's hear how Selma Middle made the impossible possible. Welcome, Principal Stephen Baker.
Thank you so much. It is great to be with you and to have this conversation today. It's one of, obviously, my passions, improving schools and just being spoke in the will of education, doing our part. And I would not be doing Brandon Garland much justice if I didn't make one little tweak to, and that was a wonderful introduction to what we came to here. Thank you so much. And but Brandon Garland was the innovation officer at that time, and I was the academic officer. So we worked in concert together there, but you're right. Then I asked if I could, if not there, come here.
That's right.
And then shortly thereafter, 6 years later, here we are.
Here we are. Well,
here we are.
Let's get into it. We know who you are, but we need to know more about where we are now, right? And so there were a couple of things working against Selma Middle School, right? I've outlined a few of them: the state letter, school letter grade of an F and low performing, what have you, but also there was an additional designation of CSI, which stood for Comprehensive School of Improvement, meaning that every single student performance subgroup was low performing, correct?
Correct.
Mm-hmm. And
yes,
then COVID. So COVID, there were many educators who were making excuses for declining student performance, while your school was defying the odds and made exceptional leaps. Talk to us about student achievement and growth results in 2022, the first accountability testing year after COVID-19.
Yeah, if I could just kind of jump in and we go through the weeds a little bit, and then hopefully come out on the other side where we have a good understanding of the context, and guide me at any point that I might chase a rabbit too far. But in 2019, we were CSI, which, as you know, means you're in the bottom 5% of all Title I schools. And as you said, we were literally the 10th lowest growth school in the state of North Carolina out of 2,500 at the time. I think we're around 2,700 now. And that does include, of course, it does include charter schools as well.
Yes.
So we were here 6 months, very excited about, that possibility of making a direct impact for our community. And it was very personal for me at the time, too, I think, as part of the context to say my mom's from Selma. And so when I got the opportunity to do something I never dreamed I would get to do, I was quite excited. And I joked that she wasn't going to let me fail because it was her hometown. And so, but you do come up with a plan. You think you have a great plan. You're starting to gather the right people. And then 6 months later, I believe it was on a Friday afternoon, we didn't come back because of COVID. Mm-hmm. And so now you are looking at being the 10th lowest growth school in the state, how do you help children learn through something that is a once in a 100-year episode or event?
Yeah.
And so we really at that point had to dig down deep and really start using some data and some research to find out what to do. And just to jump to the end, because I would love to get into the details of that, of what we focused on and what we did. But I think looking at the end result's important, because why would we listen if we didn't have outcomes to support what I'm talking about? But so we come out in 21-22. We did not test in 2019-20. We did test in 2020-21, but that was like a dry run. It did not count in terms of your school performance grade, but it was to get everybody back into that groove of we go to school to learn. We assess to see if we've learned or not. And then, so in 21-22, we came out of the pandemic. We went from the bottom 10th, the 10th lowest school in the state, so the bottom 5%. And we came out right after that pandemic, the first year that we tested that counted, and we were in the top 10% of growth.
Oh my!
We literally are tied for number 228 out of those 2,500 schools.
My goodness.
And so, that is quite miraculous and a testament to the hard work of a community, the students and teachers. And so that to me makes the story important for others, because if Selma could do it during a pandemic, we know that it can be done.
You made the impossible possible with your entire team and exceeded growth in 2022. If I'm not mistaken, in 2024, you also exceeded growth. That was just last year.
Yeah, that's exciting to me as well, because we came out of the pandemic when many people went backwards, and understandably so. There is no judgment in this at all. I can understand how that happened. So how did a school, the 10th lowest growth in the state, come out in the top 10% of growth, exceed growth, and then 2 out of 3 years exceed growth? That middle year is interesting to me, and it provides some context to our journey as well. When you have a good plan and you can define those variables, then you can tweak and you know what you've done so you can adjust. So we came out of, and we're in the top 10 of growth. You can imagine the cheers and the high fives, and we're so proud of our students and our community. We have an amazing community that's very supportive, from local government, the mayor on down to our families. And so it was really a group effort. So we're all excited. And then in 22, 23, we met growth. And we went from tied in the top 10 to suddenly we were tied for number 1,410. Now, that does mean we're 1,400 schools above where we started.
That's correct.
But middle of the, slightly above middle of the pack is not what we're shooting for. We're shooting to be an A school, because now that means our students are growing in leaps and bounds and learning. And so, but the interesting thing there, and I think it's important for school improvement that you know what you're doing so that you can understand the results that you get. We had began to let students we really work on culture. And I'd love to get into that in a little bit, because I think it's something that's often overlooked when we go for quick results. And that's not something that we look for. We're not looking for quick. We got quick results, but it's not what was defining how we do what we do. No, and so we were allowing, we were trying for. So we were really working on students being advocates for themselves, working on the culture of the school. What does it mean to be an academic, an athlete, a student athlete? All of those things we were working on. And we have a transition that just occurred. So students are walking by. Right?
Life in the school.
Yes, this is a school. It's active, and carved a little bit of time here.
That's it.
So if I get distracted, I apologize. But where was I at? We came out of there, and we just knew we were going to get in the top 5% the following year. So what we did was began to work on students advocating for themselves. Why are you doing what you're doing? Not because I'm telling you to do it, but try to make the connections in their life to how this is going to further benefit them. Every day is a preparation for the next day, which is preparation for the next stage. And so students really began to buy in, and they started taking longer to do their assessments, longer to do their tests, using the blank pieces of paper to work problems out, to make a skeleton of their, whatever they were going to work on, they started truly giving their all to do it, and they started taking more time.
Okay.
We thought this was a good thing when it would come to MVPs or MAP assessments or these formative assessments.
Mm-hmm.
We gave them longer time to do it because we really wanted to know what they needed to know, what they had learned, what we needed to do about it. But when we came to the EOG, I realized that something might have backfired.
Mm-hmm.
As we began to take the EOGs and as we began to use the max amount of time allowable, I'm walking around the hallways with a walkie. How many do we have left? How many do we have left? And more than 3/4 of the school was still working when we ran out of time.
Wow.
Now, on the one hand, that is a huge celebration.
How were you able to really gather your staff so that they could in turn create that urgency and have students work within those time frames so that they could be more successful?
I think that is a great question, and I'm going to write it down. How
Yes.
did staff, because I'm going to come back to that in 1 second, if you don't mind, because
Sure.
that really gets into the meat and potatoes of what we're getting at.
Yes.
How was it done? What was the plan? How was it implemented?
Mhm.
So last year at the end, I had 2 students who didn't finish. And that begins to show you your intentionality. When you approach this with intentionality, you can
Yes.
begin to adjust, tweak, but you know what happened. And we went back to exceeding growth. We were tied for number 473 last
Mhm.
year.
Working
So
your
we
way
jumped
back.
up almost over 1,000 schools, clawed our way back. We were right outside the top 10, but we plan to be in there this year. So
Sure.
how do you get those results? I go back and I look at the EVOS growth composite when you're looking at
Mhm.
effectiveness and whatnot. In 2015-16, because for the entire, we are currently performing higher under this school performance grade model than at any other time under this model. And so when you go back to 2015-16, you'll see the EVOS growth composite negative 2.74. Then it goes to negative 4.52. Then it goes to negative 666. Then it goes to negative 846. So you see that downward trend very
Right.
consistently.
Right.
Then
On
you have
teacher
2 years of the
effectiveness.
pandemic, and we come
Mhm.
out plus 5.31. So how do you do that, I think, becomes really the driving question. And I'd love to jump into when you're faced with a situation and you've got to grow, what are some of those key elements that we have found to be very important? You hit on one of them, urgency. You've got to build that urgency. You cannot come to work at a school that needs your best and bring your C. You know, you can't just kind of relax, take a day off. I need a mental health day. I think I'll go shopping. Like, that is not the school
No,
that we
that
are.
doesn't work. That doesn't work. But could
No.
I plug something else
Mhm.
here though?
Mhm.
Because
Mhm.
I see where you're going, and teacher, or shall I say staff retention remained fairly high as well. Like, you were retaining your staff. So there
Yeah.
was something you were doing that allowed them to recognize what we needed to prioritize, right? Putting the kids first, helping them to understand the urgency, but it was done in a way that didn't run the staff away. So
Yeah. I think that one of the things as a principal early on that really had a profound impact on me was understanding there's not, and it's just so much worse today than before, there's not a lot of people standing behind wanting to come in and work as educators. You know, we can look at our education programs and see the decline in membership or students. And so there's really only 2 ways to improve your school. Like, it seems like rocket science. And when I first started, I can't tell you how many nights at 2 a.m. I'm reading inspirational quotes, inspirational books, videos, because I feel like I'm moving a mountain one stone at the time. And that's an impossible task. But in the end, it's fairly simple. You improve your school by hiring better teachers, or, and this is where people, it chafes them a little bit, but if they'll hear me out, I am not blaming teachers, but teachers are the answer. They have the most impact on the student's outcome, academic outcome, than any other factor. Principals have the largest impact on the school and setting that stage.
Yes.
And so when you look at the data, and I believe Marzano one year, Dr. Marzano, some people misunderstood when he said the importance of the teachers and felt like we're blaming teachers, but we're not. That's how important they are. So you either hire better teachers or improve the pedagogical practices being used by those teachers. So once you understand that teachers are the fuel for this delivery, then you cannot overlook their importance. You know, one of the things we say in modern times is not resource, but what is that? It's often used when you're talking about human capital.
Human capital.
That word bothers me a little bit because they're a resource. Capital you spend. Resources you cherish because there's a limited amount of them.
That's right.
And that's why I love the words human resources, is because once you understand that that teacher is the one who's going to stand, I can get upset, close my door, cry if I want to, but they can't. Once that planning period's over, there's another 25 kids coming, and then another 25 after that, and they're going to reach 75 to 100 something kids a day. But they are the delivery mechanism, and so without teachers, you're not going to teach kids. So understanding that teachers are a valuable resource and they are the answer should help us, those who are not in that classroom, understand we are servant leaders with emphasis on the servant part. We've got to serve. We've got to set the stage for them to be successful. And so then you begin to find the right teacher for the right situation that you may have. And that's, and then you make sure that they're valued. And then you set up, mechanisms within your school that you can support them, whether it's academically through coaching or whether it's understanding sometimes when they're going through a tough situation at home. Listen, validate, find ways around it. But we just can't go in like they used to do back in the day, do some yelling, do some directives, and then everything turns out okay. So we did go from about 50% turnover to less than 10% very quickly.
Yes.
There's some other things we did monetarily speaking, which we cannot afford at this point in time, but yet we still observe very good turnover rates or lack of turnover. And so we built that through culture, but initially it was culture and we paid stipends. And then Dr. Todd Whitaker talks a lot about what to do in the interview process. And so we would interview, and I have, 3 questions. Are you coachable? Are you positive? And are you prudent? Prudent really especially comes because of the online presence, and you can't teach somebody who saw you say hateful things online. And so we address that with candidates. This is our expectation. And then I tell them, if you give me an answer, I have a really smart candidate one time. And he said after the interview, in fact, it was a couple years ago, he said, Mr. Baker, you ask me these questions and everyone knows the right answer. So what is the purpose of these questions? And so I understand really smart folks will go down that path and say, I can tell you anything. So I told him this, well, it is kind of an intelligence test. If you don't know that's the right answer, then you're not going to end up working well here anyway, because you missed the boat on that one. But it's also a matter of not all of us can be 100% positive at all times. And so not all of us can be prudent at all times. We don't always feel coachable. But if you will answer to the yes, then you know what we're looking for. You might have to fake it till you make it. But I said, here's what I promise. It doesn't matter in the end if you fake it or if you're really there, because if you love working with children, if you love helping people, you will fake it until you become it, because you will begin to reap the harvest of your work. And then you won't be able to be anything but that. I said, but until you get to be 100% there, here's my promise. If you're ever not these things, I will come knocking at the door. You see, I'm writing down the answer. And then I will ask you, you told me you were, positive. And here's what I'm hearing. Can you tell me why? And I've only had to do that a couple of times. And to their credit, for instance, one time somebody told me it's been a really hard time this semester. Explain the why. And it would have been tough for anyone. And so with some empathy, but they said, I'm coming back from Christmas and you won't know the difference. And true to they're still here to this day. They still continue to lead with their heart and teach great pedagogical practices. And they were just having a tough period of time. So there's an example where they were coachable, but they weren't quite positive. But because you rarely lose all of those at one time, then we come along and help you there. So whether it's through your culture and your expectations that you set at the hiring process, or it's because of a stipend that we used to be able to afford to pay. Because I would say when you come here, I was very honest about the work we had to do. When you come here, you will work harder than anywhere else you have worked. You will be wore out by November.
Right. And many have heard that.
Yes, but the outcomes will be so rewarding because you're going to do things that you're not necessarily going to be able to do elsewhere, because we are all on the same mission, on the same page. And again, that gets back to that culture. So great question there. I hope I answered it sufficiently.
You did. And I think that's going to be very helpful to our listening audience. If we could also talk about some of the school level improvement efforts around, say, your school improvement team, the role of your school improvement team chair, right? Because in some schools, the process is not done with authenticity. And Selma Middle School really did take school improvement seriously. And the SIT chair, the school improvement team chair, was a real role in your school. You also had MCLs, multi-classroom leaders, and there's power in building teacher leadership. And then there's a gap lab. And so these are three things, systems, I would say, that you had in place that really led to the improved outcomes that your school saw. So if you could speak to each of those just briefly, so that you can paint a picture for folks to understand, well, school improvement planning, I take the plan, it sits on the shelf, it collects dust, but no, here it doesn't. How did you move the needle through the school improvement team, your MCLs, multi-classroom leaders, and the Gap Lab focused on student performance and student success?
Dr. Paul Batalden talks about every system is perfectly designed to achieve the results it gets.
Yes.
When I first heard that about my third year into being a principal, it felt like a slap in the face. And I realized sometimes I get busy blaming people versus looking at the system. And so if I could just in a kind of wrap up quickly how we approach starting here, because those systems fit into this kind of funnel to how do we get to that. First, you cannot blame. It's very easy to blame people when you go to a low performing school. You can blame the students for not wanting to learn. You could blame the parents for this or that, but no one ever really blames themselves. But what is the only thing we can control? Ourselves. So you got to shift that mindset. How are you going to organize the work? For me, I came here organizing the work with Marzano's What Works in Schools, using research, putting research into action. I'm going to mess that title up a little bit because I've been using the book for so long. I should have the title. But Marzano's What Works in Schools, putting research into action. And you organize the work because, again, it's very overwhelming when you start. So you organize the work into school level, teacher level, student level. And that I could understand. Okay, now I've got 3 levels to worry about. And each one of those, I could probably talk 20 minutes just about each level. But suffice it to say that there are other organizational methods, but this is the one that's my canon. And so that's how I'm going to organize. Is there a partner you can work with? If you have a partner at central office, so they can be so helpful, as you know, in running through some of those barriers, not running through them, but working around those that maybe could be stressful to you, but somebody could take that, help other people understand, come back. So having that liaison at the district level is very helpful. And then you might have an outside partner. We worked with West Ed before. He uses the Vital Protocol. It's been very helpful. But really, how we organized it, the partner comes along and helps you with those things. And then be data-driven, of course. Data needs to drive all things because you don't have time to just throw mud at the wall and hope it works. And then, as we've talked about, the urgency. And then the secret sauce, I think, is culture. Whenever I'm speaking to folks about school improvement, they want to know, I was at a conference recently and somebody came up and said, hey, I saw your your teacher retention data. I wanted to talk to you about that.
Yeah.
you can always know if somebody's really serious or are they looking for a quick fix when if their eyes don't glaze over when you get to culture and the path to get to a strong culture within your school. But otherwise, you could use fear and do things very quickly. You can use money and motivate very quickly. But if you want to sustain this effort, and this is year 6 for us, if you want to sustain the effort, you must create a culture and then let people come and go until the right people who believe in the right things are at your school. I'll give you an example of culture that is just low-hanging fruit, so forgive me, but it's a quick and easy way to understand. We had summer school a few years ago, and other teachers came in to help. And I had one of my teachers come at the end of the day, almost crying, and said, other teachers just aren't like us. I said, well, what do you mean? She said, I overheard a classroom getting a little rowdy, which we can all understand during the summer, and said, but I heard the teacher say this, listen, I'm here to get my check for teaching you and you're here to learn.
Oh my.
Our teachers would not accept a colleague saying that. I've heard, I forget the CEO, but there was a CEO, and I've shared this with my staff, who said, if you need to be managed in the 21st century, you are useless to your organization. And that's not school specific. So you got to find people who believe in what they're doing and are willing to go the extra mile to do it. So to me, culture is that secret sauce. But if you're talking to somebody, their eyes glaze over, then you know they're not really interested in doing the work that needs to be done. And so you can just go ahead and save your breath and walk away, because all the other things don't work without the right culture. You can get a bump, but culture is going to sustain that so that you can continue because you never really arrive. Like if you're an A school, you want to be a higher A school. And then it's like a team.
Room. Yeah,
there's always room because there's another cohort coming behind them, right? So anyway, and then so to get at your question about SIT, MCLs, and Gap Lab, when we organize the work through that lens, then there's also another central tenet that I believe, and it is use data and then find the right arrow for multiple targets. You don't have time when you're turning a school around with a group of individuals to have everyone kind of going in their own direction. And I don't have the energy or capacity to really focus, say, on one thing. So you need what you're doing to impact multiple targets. And so I think a good academic,
you're just maximizing the capacity of the folks, the resources that you have available at hand. If you could give us an example of how you used that concept with the multiple arrows and using the resources to kind of maximize, give us an example of that.
All right. There's a couple I like to give, and so that we can think about it in educational terms. Achieving multiple goals with one strategy. So when you look at crystallized and fluid intelligence, most people think of intelligence like fluid intelligence. If there's several of us in a room and somebody puts a complex puzzle, one of us is going to do it faster than the other person. That's just an example of fluid intelligence. I know it's much more complicated than that. Crystallized intelligence is not necessarily innate ability. It is the experiences and the skills that we have been taught and learned. What we know through research is, and I do feel that for a long time we ignored physiological differences or changes within our body when we looked at education. We didn't think about brain research. We didn't think about the physiological impacts of, say, cortisol. But all this takes that into account. And with crystallized intelligence, we know that it has a greater impact on academic performance than fluid intelligence. So we've all heard the famous experiment, which we wouldn't be able to do today, thank God, but where you take the quote unquote smartest academically smartest kid in the classroom, tell them that they are again, you wouldn't be able to do this today, horrible language, I'm so sorry, but the slowest. You're going to struggle. You're not good with math. You're not good with, and then you take the child who struggles the most and flip that around and tell them they're the brightest in the class. They will end up most of the time performing at the level of your expectations. Again, scary stuff, So when you look at that and understand that, then sorry, I got distracted and I got to thinking about that poor kid being told that. But students will rise to the expectations that we give. And I should have written your question down because I'm going off on a tangent now, but give me that question again. I'm so sorry.
You mentioned that you want to use multiple arrows, correct? And
Yes.
you want to be able to target and maximize your resources that you have at hand, because there's so many different areas that require the attention of the teachers, of you. And so how do we maximize that resource and hit multiple targets
Got
at
it.
the same time? And just if you could
So I got sidetracked with Chris.
Mhm. But
I
just
got
one
sidetracked
example
with
of that.
crystallized intelligence, but it did have a point that, thank you for connecting me back to the track. I just get so excited, and then I'm
That's all
all
right.
right. So,
I don't want to quench that excitement. I want it to keep coming. It's okay.
so that's where you understand that just fluid intelligence or your natural ability is not the end all and be all, nor was IQ ever designed to limit students. And we use that, unfortunately, in that way to rank students sometimes. But crystallized intelligence has a greater impact, and we know how to increase that. There are direct and indirect ways. So that gets to our arrow, multiple targets. So a direct way to increase crystallized intelligence, which again has a greater direct impact on academic performance. Here's what it would look like when you say, I don't need to just teach vocabulary. Like we all know, when you start talking about a viable and guaranteed curriculum, I might need to teach vocabulary so that they can access that. When I say I'm going to have equal access to folks, well, if I'm right off of 95, so I have students come and go almost daily. They can come from other countries, move to other states. They might have missed the introduction. They might not be familiar with those words. So, you need a word wall. Well, in teaching that, some folks would only think of that as access to the curriculum. Whereas when you start thinking that I always need to be doing multiple things with that one strategy, you begin to understand things like this. When I teach vocabulary, I'm increasing access to the curriculum. It is a direct way, because of experiences, because of use of language, is a direct way to increase crystallized intelligence. And I might need to just add a couple of strategies while I'm teaching vocabulary so that it accomplishes that. So I'm using the same amount of capacity, the same amount of resources, but with some intentionality, I'm now hitting multiple targets because now I'm increasing crystallized intelligence, but I'm also giving them access to that curriculum. An indirect way would be an example. I also want to say that in this case, you would get 3 targets, in my opinion. If you look at Hattie and the effect size, teaching vocabulary has a 0 points. And if I get a 10th or so off, I apologize, but a 10th would actually be bad. If I get 100th off, excuse me, but the 10th is solid. 0.67, I believe, effect size. And we know the hinge point there is 0.4. If you do something above 0.4, you're going to get a positive impact. Well, a 0.67 is actually substantial. So you are using a high leverage teaching strategy by teaching vocabulary, along with giving access to the curriculum, along with increasing crystallized intelligence. Great way of a direct method to do multiple things. So an indirect method still could have multiple targets, one arrow. Take, for example, mentoring. Everyone goes to a school that's performing low and says, we need to mentor them. And we think of like big brother, big sister, arm, listening. I'm sorry your life is so bad. That's a horrible way to say it, but hopefully my point's made. The problem with that is that's a narrow view. We do want to provide emotional support to somebody whose life they may be going through some things at home. They may be going through unstable housing. Poverty brings a lot of barriers, and mentoring can help emotionally with that child. But think about a mentoring program that understands its importance, that says, you know what I'm going to do, Steve? I'm not just going to come put my arm around you and listen and help you work through some of the very real trauma. We get into the ACE and all that, but very real trauma. But I'm going to take you to a museum and give you an experience. I'm going to take you to a food pantry, and we're going to hand out food. Now we're starting to indirectly, through experiences, if you think about crystallized intelligence is experience, and then going to a museum, you're gaining experience. But vocabulary is direct because you're teaching a direct skill. I should have mentioned that earlier. So there's like experiential things, and then we're teaching direct skills. So vocabulary is direct because you're teaching a direct skill. Indirect means I'm starting to absorb, I'm gaining more experiences, but it also increases crystallized intelligence. And so I'm not just mentoring to help them emotionally. They'll have better attendance, better dealing with conflict at school, but now I'm increasing their background knowledge. So now I'm not only helping them social emotional, I'm helping them with their crystallized intelligence. So there again is two targets, one arrow. And I find this to be so incredibly important.
And you've opened the door in a sense when you mention mentoring and what we're doing for even the children, because when I think about the Gap Lab that you all created, there you had a group of children who were disengaged and in jeopardy of us losing them to the system, right? And so dropout rates would have risen at the middle school level. But by now designing a Gap Lab, you were recapturing those children. They were getting the mentoring that they needed. They were getting exactly what they needed to remain engaged and thus become successful and improve graduation rates. If you could talk a little bit about what the Gap Lab stands for and some of the successes that you've had as far as reducing the dropout rate.
So when we looked at our systems in place to help students reach their potential, it became important, and there are students in non-traditional situations that truly can bring you to tears if you get into the emotion of it. And we so often think of our students as not having grit. And I've got to be honest with you, my students have more grit than I do. They can make it through some things that I'm not sure I'd make it through. But when you are in crisis and your ACEs have added up and you look at cortisol levels, I work with often have communication with a local doctor, Dr. Liverman. He's a medical doctor that has been on a journey to also study learning and the physiological effects. When you look at cortisol, he says it was a great thing to have cortisol back in the day of dinosaurs. You don't want to think when it comes to fight or flight and that cortisol hits, you need to run or you need to fight. You do not need to think, because if you think, you're going to freeze and you're going to get eaten. But cortisol levels, when they are elevated, physiologically, you cannot truly think and you cannot learn. So when you live in poverty or you are faced with traumatic events, your cortisol levels remain elevated. And it is like having a broken arm, and we insist that you use the broken arm to write with. We must understand the physiological impact of our journey through life in terms of the task we're being asked to do. So we call that a non-traditional student who is going through something that has so distracted them. They might be a behavior problem. They might just sit there quietly and fall through the cracks because they're not causing any behavior problems, but they're not engaged. So, and of course, we all know an engaged learner is a more successful learner. So
correct.
We, for 3 years, and anything I ever talk about, I want everyone to know there's a team, whether it's here, central, parents, there's always a team. But there was a team that helped us apply for this grant. I think it was 3 years we applied for this grant. And then we received a $1.5 million grant to implement this. And for non-traditional students, we created a non-traditional setting where we could meet those needs. Mm-hmm. And so it's more student-directed. It takes into account something that might have happened at home. We address that. We can circle back around and give that student a little more control. Dr. Brian Harris He's an educator, a brain researcher, wrote several books, talks about when you are in moments of crisis and you're overwhelmed, gain control. So in the Gap Lab, for instance, we don't allow you to use your cell phone anywhere else in school. But in the Gap Lab, that teacher can choose to work with that student. That student may get to use their cell phone for 5 or 10 minutes. We've got to give them more control. You can't wear your hoodie in class. But in the Gap Lab, if I walk in, you have a hoodie, I'm not thinking twice. Like, I assume there's a reason why. So you got to give someone more control. But you can't, when you need order in a class or a standard classroom, a regular classroom, you can't just have everyone doing whatever they want to do, or you don't have order and you can't move forward. So that's why we call it a non-traditional student, a non-traditional setting. They need more one-on-one attention. It's not that they're strange and that's why we call them non-traditional. It's that they're going through a lot and we need a different approach. What is that they say? If you do this, keep doing the same thing, expect a different result, it's the first sign of insanity. That's really what drives this. Yeah. And so the student can go in there, and some of the results that we've seen from that, students who might be on the path to be incarcerated, make it through middle school.
That's right.
If you have students who have had very, very traumatic events occur, they've been able to relieve some of that stress, get very comfortable, create their own space in there. I have gone in there and seen cardboard boxes turned into like mini houses where when a kid gets overwhelmed, they could crawl into their house and just decompress and then come out and learn. And we've seen students who thought that they were horrible in school come out to be quite the mathematician. We've had students come out and they're writing poetry as they begin to find their voice in academics. But it comes down to, you've got to find ways that allow them to address SEL and reducing that stress, reducing the cortisol levels, help them do that. And then that one-on-one attention with a teacher who cares deeply and will sit and cry with them when they need that.
Most critical.
It's very critical. Yeah.
Having that educator there that understands exactly what their individual needs are. I mean, our desire would be that in every classroom that the teacher that is there understands the very needs of every single child and differentiates everything that is needed for them to be more successful. In that particular classroom, it's the non-traditional aspect that teacher really needs to embrace so that the children do become successful above and beyond the other classrooms. And you have seen great results. There are children that could have been lost that were able to graduate and move on to high school.
And the growth that you see in them, not just the personal growth, but then the academic growth that follows. I've got a scary stat to throw out there. This was shared by Dr. Liverman to me. When you start looking at learning, what is and I'm not going to answer these questions right here, but I'm going to get to a stat. What is the root determinant of learning? Where's the greatest determinant of learning? And then what percentage of academic achievement is, one, pedagogical in nature? Like what kind of pedagogy are we using? Or is it physiological? And so if we were somewhere with a group of educators having a conversation, I'd be curious to find out what percentage would they break that down. In the end, it follows the 80-20 rule. 80% is physiological, 20% is pedagogical. So when you understand how important our physiology and how it's impacted by environmental factors that we're going through, what's happening at home, what's happening at school, am I being bullied? When you start looking at those things, we can begin to better understand that child's not in class. Now, some might just be, giving you a hard time today. I was that student quite often. I didn't have a good excuse. I was just having fun. I was bored, but, and I apologize for that behavior in 8th grade.
That would be a different episode.
Yes, a different episode of how you turn your life around there. But But without us understanding that, we might accuse every kid of simply just being obstinate, when in reality, their physiology is not allowing them to engage at this moment, because that does not undermine why we have to have good practices when we're teaching. But it does highlight that you must set the learning environment. And the learning environment is not just how did you arrange your room? Do you have a good lesson plan? Is it a safe environment? It comes back, is that child ready for that learning environment? Is their body ready for the learning environment? And that gap lab allows that teacher to address that in a very strong way. We've had students come from locations like the Wright School, a residential school, and transition into the gap lab.
Yes.
Find their footing, and then go out into the regular classroom with much success. So I love that question, and but it's meeting students where they're at.
Right. And, you know, my heart desire would be that educators everywhere are meeting children where they are based on their needs. It's not easy, because then, you know, educators know there's some students they gravitate to a bit more easily than others, but that does not change the expectation, right? Because it's that relationship that's going to really help them to grow. And I want to dip into a different side of relationship on the adult side when it comes to allowing Selma Middle School to really grow. When we think about the layers of support at the school, the district, and the state, sometimes the support feels like support, which will accelerate the pace to achieving better outcomes for students. Other times, the layers present themselves as hurdles, often decelerating the pace to improved outcomes for students. I would love for you to share just a bit in the time we have remaining about district support. So often we hear about what's happening internally at the school, right? But we also know that there are those layers that we as school leaders have to navigate through that are they're supposed to be supportive, and we hope that they are. Sometimes they're not. But if you could talk about the support you've received at that level that helped Selma to get to where it is today, that would benefit our audience greatly as well.
Okay, I'm going to circle back, pick up a couple of things I didn't touch on that you asked, because it'll lead us into this.
Okay.
And again, it comes back to some cultural things. You know, all learning happens within the context of a human relationship. That's undeniable. So when you start looking at the culture, you've got to focus on your human resources, because in the end, that's where it's going to make that connection you're talking about. And you got to make sure you have the right people there. That means you need to build capacity. I think a lot of times, type A people I can do everything better myself. I might have been guilty of thinking that when I first started out. The problem with that is you don't have your gap labs, you don't have your MCLs, you don't have a sit team that's thriving and is real, versus, like you said, a document that just kind of sits there. It's not breathing, it's not moving, it doesn't tell the right story. And so it's in that understanding that I begin to understand how important the people around me are, the team. And so SIT, I was not as good working with SIT until I went to work with low performing schools. I went to a high school prior to this, and we turned that around. And then I come here after my stint at central office. And I began to really understand how SIT builds capacity. It builds leadership capacity. It builds ownership. Versus a top-down model where you are more, and of course we all use different leadership styles for different situations, but SIT is very important. And a very wise individual that worked at Central explained to me during that time, because even more so than the high school I was at, I needed SIT to be alive, breathing, giving me feedback, coming up with ideas, carrying out the ideas, really building that culture. And said, you need to understand that documents not only your goals and your strategies and your outcomes, it's also telling the story, so that if somebody wants to come and help from Central, that they are more likely to give you things that support you versus become barriers because they understand your journey because they're not there the whole time. And so I really
That
began
was a
to
wise
understand.
person.
That was a very wise person. And so, and so they may one day understand that. I'll let you decide on that one. But, and so that's an example of where Central comes along and understands what's going on, is not judging you for why you're doing something, but helps you understand and helps you improve in that area. So SIT became something where very valuable because I made a decision that even more so than the previous school I'd been at, they needed to own it. They needed that, which means they needed to be part of it. And I became very intentional of saying, sometimes it's my decision to make. Other times it's SIT's decision to make. Other times it's teachers and faculty and staffs to make. Other times it's students. And so when you start giving students voice, you've got to give and take there as well. So that's an interesting conversation, by the way, about lunch and cell phones, how we did that. But anyway, so hopefully that touches on SIT a little bit because you've got to build capacity. MCLs, an example of our coaches, that comes about out of opportunity culture where you, again, it's about building capacity within your school. And so, but it was important to us that coach also teach a class. Think about the strategy there, multiple targets again. You could get very intentional about which students that coach is going to teach. And then you can go and coach other teachers. And if you look at our surveys, North Carolina Teacher Working Conditions surveys, you will go back to 2019, see teachers that did not think what they were doing is making a difference. And you will begin to see that change in our climate and in our culture, where now today they know what they're doing makes a difference. But they needed to see coaches.
Just for clarity, really quickly. So your MCLs, multi-classroom leaders, they were coaching other teachers on their grade level or in the same content area, but they were also scheduled to teach actual classes with students, correct?
Yes.
Okay,
yes, and I think that's so important for a very quick reason. Number one, strategy. If you're hiring somebody who can coach other people, you better hire somebody who's done it really well. So we came in with the foundation of, I'm going to take some of our students who have a lot of gaps that need to be filled, and I'm going to give them to MCLs. That lets teachers have less that they need to build their capacity on. You know, Johns Hopkins talks about the narrower the range of ability in your classroom, the easier it actually is to get that lesson through. Now, there's a whole debate we can have about how we arrange our classrooms. But the truth is, if you have a range from here to the edge of this screen, that's very difficult for a teacher when we're an F school, 10th lowest in the state. So we immediately come in and our MCLs take the students with the greatest academic struggles, behavior struggles, and they teach them. They're coming in saying, we've got skill. So now they can, that allows the regular ed teacher on the hallway to be able to narrow their focus a little bit. So that was very important, but also it tells you something about the coach. How many of you out there have had coaches, they just ready to be a coach? I'm ready to get out of the classroom. And in our interview, if you said I'm ready to do something different, you would not get hired. But every coach I've hired, I had to put hooks in them, claw them, talk about, because they didn't want to leave the classroom.
Right.
They love teaching. So you need coaches that, in my opinion, that love teaching. And then that gives them street cred too. Don't come coach me when you don't even have a classroom to worry about. But if I know you're teaching some of the hardest to reach students in the school and you still are getting results, it's hard for me to argue about that because now you've got street cred. And today our teachers tell me in surveys and directly, please don't ever get rid of our MCLs. They are so helpful because they do it without judgment. So that brings us to district. That kind of, you've got to build the culture where you've built the capacity of your teachers to have a voice, to be owners in terms of ideas. And because when the question you asked about Central is one that, they have written books and books and books about. I think the answer is always in the data and the evidence. And if you look at evidence-based research, what you'll find Central is really, really good at is, number one, saying, schools, principals, you got to have goals. Those goals need to be aligned with the district. District goals need to be aligned with the state. That being said, you need to ensure accountability. Not I'm walking, have you done this? Have you done that? But like, we have walkthroughs. The district performs walkthroughs. And then they give us feedback. Are we doing what we said we were going to do? Are we not? Of course, we do that internally, but inspect what you expect. That's a great thing. And so we open our arms to people coming in and then giving us that feedback. Do you see what we say we're going to do? When you pick up that school improvement plan, are we doing that? Are we efficacious? And so that's another thing that they do. Then they look at their resources and align those resources with you for support. Mm-hmm. Then the Board of Ed sets the vision for the district, and then they ensure that central office is giving resources where it should be, whether it's human or capital or financial resources. And so are we going to buy curriculum? Are we not? Those sorts of things. What you see there in the evidence is that support aligns with those goals. They do not align well with control or micromanagement.
Yes.
And so as soon as a directive comes, the very careful dance, and we'll stay here about 30 seconds so I don't wade too deep in the water.
Setting the timer.
Yeah, set the timer, because I do not intend to say anything across to any particular group, because it takes all of us.
Yes,
it takes that support. But when that support begins to look overwhelming, it is not, it is micromanaging. It is, in your own mind, think of something. You have to remember, is it going to make a difference? And then they've also written books about how do we as a school sometimes deflect things that are counter to our mission as we have established, it's been accepted, and not make everybody upset, but somehow not let it derail us. Mm-hmm. If I could give a small example, some districts might believe in incentives, and I'm not here to say whether they work or not. I am here to say that the evidence suggests that they work narrowly. You can look at Dan and Heath, Chip and Dan Heath, I think it is. If I get their names wrong, I'm so sorry. It's been years since I read their book. Okay. You can look at Marzano, Pickering, Pollock. I mean, I could go on and on. We'll probably end up at B.F. Skinner at some point. But if you look at it, there's a very narrow way in which you are either celebrating or you're incentivizing. You must be very careful when you start incentivizing certain things. Let's say the EOG. You begin to incentivize the EOG, especially when it comes to end of grade test. I'm sorry, yes. Mm-hmm. So our summative state assessments is probably a better way to put it. Mm-hmm. There's some danger there when you start doing that. One, you created a culture where everybody needs to give their best the first time, and then you start incentivizing, hey, if you take some time off, we'll actually incentivize you to take it the second time. I've literally heard kids talk about that. I don't need to give my best. I mean, I might get some headphones if I come back the second time. Dangerous. You would like to use incentives for things like, hey, let's say we have a panorama survey that we give students. And let's say we want 100% completion. We're not asking for specific results. We just want 100% completion. We might incentivize that and say, hey, if we get 100% completion, then we are going to have some ice cream. But with the EOG, it's much deeper. You would want to have, like, our students individually set goals. The classroom sets the goals, the school sets goals, and then we look at how all those align, and always 100% effort. So in that regard, we would want to celebrate students who meet their goals or who give 100% and didn't quite reach it. But when we start incentivizing, it can have a negative impact on that journey. And so there's some things you incentivize, others not. There's a lot of research that shows it begins to have a negative impact if not done correctly. So there's an example with how would you as a school, it's a real example, hopefully people can identify with to answer your question. And I would do it this way. Let's say you were given, I'm just going to pick out of thin air. You were given an email and you were like, hey, please fill in how you're going to incentivize your state assessments at the end of the year. Well, as a school, you just start the delicate dance of explaining that. You know what we do? We set goals as students, classrooms, hallways, school, and we have celebrations when we meet those goals as we do our formative assessments leading up to. We do not give incentives to come and retake the EOG, but what we do is, for instance, this year we're starting academic jackets. Students told me they really like some of the jackets we were giving teachers. What's theirs? So honor roll will become that academic jacket, multiple targets, one arrow. Can you imagine walking around our small town pridefully wearing that? And now people, hey, how did you get that? I'm on the principal's list, all A's,
Right.
and then this something for honor roll and so on and so forth. We started giving awards for the accomplishments of students, and suddenly everybody coming at the end of the year receiving their certificate is getting some sort of academic award, some sort of behavior award. So to me, that is how, a very real example, how do you balance, especially the larger your district is, how do you balance things that may not be in alignment with what your goal and mission is at your school, but still not being judgmental and saying, you're so far off base, I'm just not going to do it. Not many of us can get away with saying, I'm just not going to do it.
Right, right. But when we think about it, you toe the line, right? And you tread very
Mm-hmm.
carefully. But even with all of that aside, you honestly cannot be faulted for wanting to align every single thing with your school improvement plan. Because when you think about it, it's a plan that was put together with intention. It was put together strategically to meet the needs of every single student and adult and family in the community. And so when we think along those lines, then we are making decisions beforehand versus after, right? And so if we know that these incentives are coming, we can work those into our plans, school improvement
Yeah.
plans, at the beginning of the year so that it makes sense and is communicated and everyone can understand that, hey, we're working towards improved achievement outcomes. And when we hit those, these are the incentives that are in line for us, like a marketing tool for success. We
Right.
do those things in advance, right? Not at the last minute. It makes more
Right.
sense. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, intentionality you're talking about, I think, is so important because, again, instead of saying, if you assume good intention of folks, instead of going, like, that's the dumbest idea I've ever heard, walk in their shoes a little bit. A very wise principal when I was a little baby AP told me that. He said a couple wise things, many wise things. One of them was, you're never going to be a good administrator until you quit caring who's right.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I was just all about who was right, and walk a mile in your teacher's shoes or anyone else's shoes before you judge them. So if we assume positive intent, then the district level came up with something. They probably read a book, went to a conference, saw it work somewhere, and had positive intent. So if we know that's probably going to come or something else, if we work that into our school improvement plan, that school improvement plan is also a buffer. We've acknowledged that people have some good ideas. We've made it fit our situation and context, put it in our school improvement plan, which is, guess what, voted on.
That's right.
And that becomes the document that we have to follow because it's voted on by all those parties I mentioned. And so everyone's already said, hey, this is what you can do. This is what you're going to do. And so then that kind of reduces the unnecessary conversations that need to occur that might become emotional when in reality, let's just assume everyone has good intent, but we are the ones carrying out the plan and our marching orders come from this SIT plan. And that is voted on, so that becomes law.
Mm-hmm. That's right. And the buy-in is already embedded, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Wow. Well, this has been amazing, Principal Baker. I just want to thank you for all that you shared today, just during our time together. I want to add here that a point of reflection that I'd love to hear from you. When you reflect, you're a lifetime lead learner and you reflect on your many years in leadership. What support do you believe district leaders can and should provide so that authentic support is felt by the school leaders in their school system? So you've sat in the seat at the district level. You've sat in the seat as principal. You've taught. You've served in many roles. When you reflect in these many years as a leader, what support do you believe district leaders can and should provide so that authentic support is felt by the school leaders in their school system?
I think it comes down to data, to evidence. We should be driven at the school level and at the district level by evidence-based research for that context. That allows me now to see each of the schools I'm serving differently. One broad stroke cannot do it all, but if we use evidence-based for that context, we can provide the right supports. Whether it's how do we serve specific populations, how do we improve teacher growth. Whenever we get to the idea fairy, in every book that I read, every conference that I go to, I have an idea on a napkin because I had a late conversation, and we begin to apply that blanket to the schools, we can almost guarantee a low success rate because it will work, but there's a context within which it works. So for support to be valued, the school's got to be validated for their context. For it to be useful, it must be evidence-based for that context. And hopefully that answers your question. But the reason I'm so intentional about that is there's a charter school called Henderson Collegiate that I went and visited when it first opened up. I knew one of their cousins. It's a husband and wife team that started it, and their cousin was my assistant principal. And we went there early on. And we went back 5 years later, and the difference was awe-inspiring. And I asked them, how did you do that? And they said this, and I think this applies to Central as well, 1% at a time. He said, you can often go to like a Leader in Me school, somewhere where you just teach like a pirate, and you go and you're in awe and you try to bring it all back. But your context was not such. They worked for years to build the culture, get the context. Right. And you go there and think in 6 months you're going to know. It said, what would happen is we would study, and and any good reform starts with doing an assessment of yourself and where you're at. And then you find out what is something that we need support in. He said we might study it for months until we can narrow down succinctly. If you can't describe the problem, you don't really understand it. So succinctly identify the problem. Then you might spend time finding that answer that's evidence-based for that specific situation. So you would never want to, for instance, you can see tons of books back there, I got Elizabeth Green over here, Building a Better Teacher. Excellent book. Driven by Data is right there. But I would never take a book and then try to apply it across the board. I'd be looking for, it might be fun to read, but you're looking for what does that school need? Where's the evidence-based solution for that school? And now let's meet together and see how you could implement that.
That's right. That's right. Based on their context.
Yes.
One size does not fit all. I thank you
Usually
so much.
Does not.
I wanted to just add here, Selma Middle School made the impossible possible. 2 out of the last 3 years, you've exceeded growth. The students are not in the same place they used to be. Culture has improved tremendously. Selma Middle School is no longer a CSI school where every student subgroup fails to show growth in grade level proficiency. The needle has turned. Selma Middle is no longer marked by an F school letter grade and unmet growth. Every day was not perfect, but you sparked something special in your staff and staff retention remained high. Selma Middle School teachers are leaders and they want to see children succeed. I applaud you, I applaud your team, and I encourage you to keep it going for as long as you have the energy, capacity, and passion to keep it going. Because when those are gone, it's time to decrease. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much. I've enjoyed spending this time with you and having the conversation. It's made my day. Thank you.